Hello and welcome to another edition of Razorwire. Today we're going to be navigating the courses of cybersecurity legislation from government institutions and other institutions related to those types of organizations. And in order to do that, I thought, who can I get who really knows this environment and has a number of customers under very strict legislation from government on the services that they provide. And I thought of Dragos. So we have the wonderful Steve and Phil who, can tell us a little bit more about what he's seeing from kind of like their customer side and some of the conflicts and issues and difficulties that they actually have themselves. So please, let's hop down this bunny trail and see what we can get. So let's do the introductions. So here today to talk about legislation and navigating this wonderful world of cybersecurity in an ever-changing world. I have two special guests. I have Steve and Phil, both from Dragos. I'll get them to introduce themselves and who they are. So Steve, shall we start with yourself?
Yes, thank you for this opportunity, Jim. I am the CISO of Dragos. I've been doing cybersecurity since the late 1980s. It wasn't necessarily called cybersecurity back then, but I've focused a lot of my career on OT, ICS, and which is heavily regulated, as you know. So I've got kind of a warm spot in my heart for how to deal with legislation and how to, where it's the ins and outs are of governance in general.
Fantastic. And Phil?
Hi, I'm Phil Tonkin. I'm Chief of Staff at Dragos, and Chief of Staff to the CEO. My role, on a day-by-day basis often involves me engaging with customers and listening to the needs that they have, in particular in resolving the issues that many critical infrastructure companies have around the globe. I joined the cybersecurity industry only a few years ago, but I'd focused on cybersecurity with my previous employer for the 5 or 6 years before that. But my career has really spanned many different engineering functions and understanding how to manage assets and how to manage risks within those spaces. So I'm one of those people who transition from looking after the systems that we're now trying to protect, and by getting an understanding of how those systems work, and what risks they face. You could understand the challenges that the additional threat vector of cybersecurity offers.
Fantastic. I've been looking forward to speaking with you guys on a number of different subject matters for a little while. I think, you guys have quite a unique kind of offering where you do get involved in a lot of organizations who are kind of subject to the kind of legislation that most other organizations don't tend to come across. I mean, there's plenty of people out there that are used to kind of like financial regulation, that kind of thing. But when it comes to like government, especially OT, it's quite extensive. And I know that, from cybersecurity perspective, like legislation in this space is relatively new in the grand scheme of things. You go back 10 years and the legislation was very, very loose because I think a lot of people looked at InfoSec as not really a thing that you needed to worry about. And how that has changed in recent times. I mean, I turned on the news this morning and, I do it every morning. It's like, who's been compromised today? Who's gotten themselves in trouble? What water company has been done by a particular group out in certain parts of the world who may not be annoyed at another certain part of the world? What nuclear facility has been done? I think in the UK, Sellafield has just been reported to have been compromised. And I think, what we're seeing in recent times is quite a big uptick in both commercial kind of like compliance requirements such as PCI DSS, the need for ISO 27001, but we're also starting to see a lot of governments start to really catch up as well and take the kind of cybersecurity piece really seriously. I mean, Steve, you're from over the pond in the States, and I mean, you've recently had your president, Mr. Biden, legislate against kind of like the AI side of things, which has, I know, been quite a big piece for sort of Silicon Valley. But you guys are starting to see quite a significant change in the way of things working over there because of that colonial pipeline issue that occurred a few years ago. Do you just want to kind of give us a bit of a view of what your thoughts and what you're seeing over there in the States? Because no doubt we're going to be seeing either something similar over here or we're going to be seeing it relatively soon.
Yeah, I think, that first and foremost, I think that there's a lot of confusion in the CISO community and the practitioner community, the asset owners. If you ask, and again, Phil might be able to elaborate on this, as he spends a lot more time with customers. But if you ask a person that owns a cybersecurity program at a company and say, what do you need from the government? They're likely going to say, I don't want the government involved at all, because now if the government's involved, now I've got to set up a whole new compliance wing. I've got to take dollars from my actual tangible security budget and put it into trying to protect this new, risk of non-compliance or whatever, especially when it has teeth, when there's millions of dollars or whatever of levy or fines if you are found non-compliant. Whenever the people are looking for guidance, but when they look at at the guidance that's available today, you've got most companies, it seems like now, are starting to have to deal with international regulations. So they've got, like you're talking about, there's executive orders, and there's some things that apply to everyone across the board in the U.S., and then there's state specific legislation, and then there's now anything we have to deal with countries where we do business. It just gets really complicated. There's no kind of Rosetta Stone or something to say, okay, here's what I have to do for, take your pick, for password complexity and length, or for, encryption. There's no just one size fits all. If I do this and meet this need, this will take care of all compliances. So you instead have to protect two certain compliances and map all these controls, and it just gets unwieldy and it changes. It's such a moving target. If you think you're doing okay today, and you haven't looked for a couple of weeks, there might be some new legislation or change that you have to meet. It just makes another risk that's difficult and could possibly take scarce resources away from an area where we're sometimes starting to make some traction and get ahead of the thing.
It must be crazy for you guys, actually, because I mean, over here in the UK, and we'll kind of move over to Phil, shortly. But we don't have quite as much difficult legislation to kind of navigate, because as you quite rightly pointed out, Steve, you've got the local state, you've got the federal requirements, then you've got any kind of like additional government requirements via industry standards. You've got things like HIPAA as well. So kind of like, if you're the CISO of an American organization or an organization, that's multinational and has, locations in the States, as well as say in Europe or whatever, you've got GDPR over here to worry about. You've got kind of like, legislation over there. You've got, how do you kind of track all of this? I mean, is this something that you've literally got to the point where we really need to have some kind of GRC tool to figure out what's going on across the board? Because you could kind of comply with one legislation, I'm guessing, but it might not quite comply with another legislation that requires, say, a stronger password or multi-factor authentication, or, do you have somebody you actually employ to do this, or is this looking increasingly like something that you might end up having to do?
Absolutely. I think both things that you said, you have to have a tool of some sort. The days of trying to manage this with a spreadsheet, even if you had an army of people, that's going to be impossible. And not just a tool that, does mapping and crosswalks across controls and things, but you have to have some way to be looking out there and seeing what's coming new, like crawlers or some kind of feeds to keep the tools updated. And then, like you say, a dedicated team. It's the hard part. The hard part of security should be the security part, the trying to figure out what controls are effective, have a threat, threat intelligence that feeds and builds your, efficacy of your tool base and things like that. But it seems like now that's almost more tangible and more defined in a way than the compliance framework. So you end up having to have almost two sets of teams. It's a kind of different skill set too. I've learned this even recently, back, I don't know 15 years ago, 10 years ago, it seemed like security people just had to have a GRC acumen bolted onto their career. That had to be like a crossover where they did it all. But it just seems like now they're starting to specialize. And some of the people that you'll hire that have hard technical skills, fantastic penetration testers or whatever, code level, AppSec assessors and things, that doesn't necessarily translate over to writing standards and policies that meet the needs of all the compliance, to assessing to determine if they meet the minimum requirements or not, and stuff like that. So it seems like we're building a new, we at one time IT and security was even one thing, and then I mentioned, I did security and I guess as early as 1989. And the security back then was mainly just access control, physical security. In the military, it was things like ensuring that people can't snoop on the wire, like converting to fiber when you went outside or whatever, things like that. But then over time, that became its own specialty, and they separated. Now, same kind of thing. A security person is going to separate from, it seems like, from GRC, and it's going to have more of a legal acumen, understanding all the ins and outs of every word and what the ramifications are.
And it's funny you should say that. Weirdly enough, I was talking with another colleague, a friend of mine, and the other day, and there seems to be this new breed of InfoSec person springing up from the legal sector of all things, which I never thought I would see. But you've got cybersecurity specialists in the legal sector now, and it's like, wow, okay, this is very different from the 25 years ago when it was all sticky tape and chewing gum and everything was kind of put together. Now we have entire legal sort of representatives whose sole job is to understand legislation, whether you're in, whether you're out of it, and how to argue, in the event that there is an issue or whatever. But let's move over to Phil. Phil, I mean, what are we seeing in kind of the more European side of things when it comes to legislation? I mean, we've got DORA incoming soon. Well, it's technically already in. It's just not kicked off just yet, which is going to be a real big game changer in Europe. But, what are your thoughts on the subject matter of legislation?
Yeah, I think it's been a really sort of interesting journey over the last few years in Europe and the UK. A lot of the legislation, in particular that affects critical infrastructure companies, has come a lot later in the journey. When you look at the history in the US with things like NERC regulations that apply to the electricity industry, it's been there for a long time, and it's had time to develop, and it had a purpose. It occurred to set up that kind of legislation to manage a risk that companies didn't necessarily believe in at the time it was brought in. And I think that's when regulation and compliance can really work. When you just when there's not necessarily any motivation to do the right thing, you've got to come in with specific controls that are very measurable, and it drives people to do something. And without a doubt, that moves the risk needle somewhat. But one of the big challenges with a lot of compliance frameworks is that being compliant doesn't necessarily mean you're managing the risks. It doesn't mean you're necessarily managing the specific threats that are out there. And so legislation that's come later, and we've seen that with the European Union and the NIS directive, and the NIS 2 coming into enforcement, next year across the member states of the EU, is there's been a maturing of the types of control framework that are put on to the organisations that are being measured against it, and in many cases they are risk-based controls now. They allow organisations to identify the right kind of compliance metrics that will help them to demonstrate that they are mitigating certain types of risks rather than having to implement certain controls. So in the UK, the NIS directive, it does have indicators of good practice, which helps you understand what sort of things you might put in, but it doesn't mandate that you must have those specific controls in place. You can have other mitigating controls against a particular type of threat. And I think that just goes to show the journey that organizations are on. The European Union moving to NIS 2, this is all about addressing some of the gaps that were there in NIS 1 from 2018, and we're seeing the constant maturing. But it is a very fast-moving legislative environment. You got everything from DORA, the Cyber Resilience Act, the Network Code on cybersecurity, and NIS 2 coming into force all next year. There's a huge amount of movement in Europe right now, and there's a lot of complexity. And there is a risk that organizations have a lower tolerance to compliance risk than the risks that they have from the outside world. So they will put a lot of effort into demonstrating compliance. That is a transfer of effort and resources and funds towards demonstrating compliance over managing and mitigating those specific risks. Like as Steve was saying, you really do need to have a proper threat-led approach to understanding the risks that you face as an organization. Who's targeting not just me, but the type of industry that I'm in. What are the tactics that they're actually using? That helps you to understand what should I really try and address. But if you've got a compliance framework that says everything should be patched within a certain period of time, you can run around patching things that are just totally unnecessary. But that's the sort of thing that people will do because it's the only thing that's really measurable to them because they haven't invested in that risk-based process. So yeah, there's a lot going on. There's a lot for people to keep on top of. I think we're fortunate that it's newer legislation that's built on some sort of foresight of what's happened in the past in other countries, but it's still got there's a big uplift for many organizations who are just starting to fall into that compliance space. NIS2 brings a lot of operators of infrastructure in that weren't in the original legislation when you look across many of the European countries. And we're seeing sort of a tightening of capabilities as the UK government start to think about what to do with its NIS regulations as well. So it's challenging time.
I've always had a bit of a love-hate relationship with legislation and in many respects compliance as well. I mean, commercial compliance, I think, is a very different animal to legislation. I find a lot of legislation is massively knee-jerk. It's like something happens, something bad happens, the government kind of goes, oh, we've got to get involved because we can't have this kind of happen again. And then, 5 minutes later, you've got a set of directives and you're like, did they consult an InfoSec person when they wrote these? Because some of these are going to be very difficult to implement. And it's like, well, if this is now legislation, if this is coming in the next sort of 6 months or so, some of the changes that you suddenly see, you're like, I can't do this in 6 months. I've got a massive environment. I've got, in many respects, especially in the OT industry, and the same with the manufacturing industry, a lot of old technology, old systems that are running are, these lines that haven't necessarily had many updates in years and years and years, and you can't necessarily impose the technical, the security constraints rather on that kind of environment. Are you seeing a lot of problems with that kind of thing with some of the OT environments that you guys kind of handle on the customer side of it? Obviously, I'm not saying that your customers aren't handling it. I'm saying, it must be a significant challenge for them because if you've got a system that's 10 years old that runs, I don't know, your gas pipeline, and it's not exactly going to be in support anymore, is it? But they don't want to change it. They might not have the budget to change it, and then all of a sudden they've got this legislation that kicks them in the teeth, and they have to suddenly, try desperately to hammer this square peg in an extremely round hole.
We have certainly seen some of that sort of those initial knee jerks. Post the Colonial Pipeline incident, the importance and reliance that we have on things beyond electricity suddenly became obvious. I think historically the immediacy of any issue on the electricity grid has meant that it's became an early focus of legislators. There's never been a film where somebody's doing hacking where they're not trying to switch off lights. It's whether their objective is to rob a bank or something more nefarious. It's been dramatized by Hollywood for a long time, but pipelines are different. Pipelines, the impacts of something like a cyber attack are much less immediate, but can be much more significant. And I think that's in the past years made it much harder to legislate for, because the typical attack that you imagine against a piece of infrastructure is switching the lights off. You click a button, it opens a circuit breaker and the lights go out. There is no equivalent on a pipeline. They've got things like line pack, that keep it flowing for some time. You might say operational disruption, but not necessarily an immediate impact to many people. But over time and over days, those things become more obvious. And so we saw that the gaps in legislation suddenly being brought to public attention there, and so there was a very fast reaction, which was necessary by legislators like TSA, who are responsible for pipeline security, but actually, with some collaboration on the initial some initial consultation with the private owners of infrastructure and by listening to security experts, a lot of the initial proposals, which were very NERC-CIP-like, with very demanding timelines, were changed to much more risk-based controls. And so I think it's understandable, the fast reactions that legislators will bring in when there's a public demand. We're a very reactionary society now. That level of communication and connectivity we have means we demand things faster, and we strive towards popularism. So I think there's a certain expectation that when something happens, legislators are just going to turn around and fix it very quickly. But modifying like I say, a 10-year-old or 20-year-old system on supporting a pipeline can't be done overnight. And so I think it's difficult when those things come in quickly, and there is that reaction to it. Legislators are reacting to a threat landscape that's changing very, very quickly as well. So again, it's very understandable that they're driving that, but there has to be a certain amount of realism to how quickly a change can occur in a legacy industry.
Yeah, otherwise you end up introducing operational risk that's much more real than the potential for a cybersecurity, a breach or a cybersecurity fine. Yeah, I have anecdotes. I was a NERC-CIP auditor for a while, and I remember going to one place, and the CISO came out and talked to us before the audit and said, "I've instructed my people to turn off any device that's the least bit out of compliance." And they started naming all the stuff, and as we started looking through, they had done that already. They had turned off certain control systems, and they had lost visibility. And they made a decision and said, "This loss of visibility is a risk, yes, but we have other manual controls, and we know which lineman is out on which device or which pole or whatever at any given time. We're using radios." And so they literally were so worried about a violation that they went out and decreased their capability and their visibility and basically put human lives at risk.
There's a kind of intrinsic risk between do we kind of follow this sudden change in legislation that has suddenly occurred and now we need to get it done, and kind of lose visibility because suddenly we've got to turn off a load of systems that we've been relying on for so many years, versus keeping them on and then running the risk of being attacked. I get the impression in many respects, with a lot of legislation coming out, especially government, that it's more based upon the outcry from the public. I remember the public outcry, for instance, we're using the Colonial Pipeline as a good example because it was a really good example of something that occurred relatively recently, where there was like awareness immediately, because the reports were coming in, the oil's going to run out and no one's going to be able to do anything, and all of a sudden cars aren't going to get filled. What was it like over in the States when this was kicking off, just listening to the media? Having visited the States myself more than a few times, I love the place. I think it's fantastic. I'm mesmerized by your TV though, because it's like, there's a lot of sensationalization on like news channels where you get like the three people arguing with one another on telly about the same subject matter. But what was it like out there when that kicked off? Did that really kind of kick the government into touch? It's like, right, we're going to need to do something immediately, calm the populace down.
I'm just trying to think of different things that that I in my life that occurred and still continue to occur whenever we have a scenario like this. But on the good side, budgets are no longer as restrictive. So but then it seems like if a CISO doesn't already have a seat at the table, this is going to allow them to have a seat at the table, but then they're going to be asked questions strictly around whatever's in the news, whatever's sexy, and if they're if they realize that they're missing hygiene, they're missing not sexy, stuff. They've got, again, you talked about old computers and old, if they've got 10 is pretty new. When you said 10, I was like, oh man, I wish. We're talking about Windows NT or something.
Yeah.
Some people are stuck with a Windows 95, and it was never designed with security in mind. And so if they're stuck on something like that, and they're now hearing about this latest threat, and they're trying to address this to the board of directors and come up with what they're doing about Log4j. I don't know. I'm just trying to think of something more modern than some Windows machine that can't be patched anymore. It's difficult sometimes. It gets a distraction. It makes a distraction where they want to try to, okay, I really like how you're engaging now, board of directors. I really get that. I get that you're very interested in this now, and you understand the threat. But then they have to turn around and exert their own expertise and take a bold step and be able to say, okay, do you remember last year when I mentioned that we got to get rid of Windows 95? They have to go back and try to address fundamentals. And sometimes that there's something that I feel like this is I think is going to resonate with Phil, what he's hearing from some of our customers is, there's you can't treat OT like IT. So you're talking about a manufacturing plant, electricity, any place where you have a lot of OT stuff, and then you're hearing about a threat against IT that may or may not even apply on the OT side. If it does, that's even more problematic. That probably means you don't have segmentation. You have nothing between your IT and your OT. So it takes this new, getting the fundamentals, the same thing that we did in IT 20 years ago, the same idea in place, like the change management, and stuff. But Phil has mentioned it 2 or 3 times. It all has to be risk-based. If we take a vanilla, approach and say we cannot have one compliance violation across anywhere, otherwise it could be $1 million, then they go to some unused system hardly, or some I don't know. I'm just trying to think of a weather feed. Very important, to know what the weather's doing. But if you have a weather, a box that all it does is accepts feeds from the weather services and it allows the people to plan maintenance and things like that, it can't be treated with the same risk as an engineering workstation or anything on the lower levels of the industrial controls.
Yeah, so again, capturing what really is key to the organization, what delivers value is so important in looking at risk. And that is actually called out in things like the NIS directive. You only have to deal with assets that are in scope. And most of the time, the IT side of the house, most of it is considered in scope because in many ways, it is the protective layer that looks after a lot of the OT. There is an intrinsic connectivity between IT and OT. There's the idea of one being air-gapped from the other is incredibly rare now. If you were to look at modern manufacturing, it would be absolutely impossible to imagine how today's modern supply chains would work without that intrinsic connectivity that exists. We talk for many years about Industry 4.0, and they said where that's come to fruition is in the manufacturing sector. You see the demand from a supermarket, deriving from particular suppliers what products need to arrive. Trucks arrive and they pull into lights out warehouses where there are pallets of goods that have been specially picked and selected by robotics. They're put onto the trucks without any human interaction. There's no way of managing a complex supply chain and that kind of variety without an intrinsic exchange of information between different organizations, and it's often at a commercial level. So you got to think about the end-to-end capability of an organization and the capacity, and so those work management systems, the enterprise management systems, the commercial systems, they're all connected in some way and have to be done in a very particular way to keep it safe. But we can't just disconnect, can't assume that there won't be connectivity. We've got to figure out how to manage that connectivity in a safe way, how we ensure that things are properly segmented and segregated, and how we have visibility of those things. We can see that communication, that necessary communication that's occurring, so that there's the ability to respond to the most important vulnerabilities, and in particular the threats that might be occurring in that space. And so it was really cool to see that in the NIS legislation, actually the idea of in-scope assets. We're not just looking at everything. We're not just seeing everything in this particular system because it's over a certain number of watts is there, but it is. But instead, getting organizations that are in scope due to their overall size to think about what's important to their operation, and driving towards that risk-based perspective. But it is in that understanding that we can't just disconnect, we can't just air gap anymore. We can't have these old-fashioned controls. You mentioned, the seller field, reports that we've just seen in the media. That it's really challenging when you get these, for organisations like that who got a non-corroborated, story comes out. It generates a huge amount of work for them, to go and deal with them. But the government departments that are responsible for looking after them, they are a NIS compliant organisation. An organisation has to be. The Office of National Nuclear Regulation is involved in looking after them. Department of Energy and Net Zero is. Will been working with them for years now to ensure NIS compliance. And it's important that we recognise that there will be very difficult controls to implement there. One of the things called out by The Guardian in their reporting on that is the fact that your USB sticks can be used on this equipment. Of course they can. They're built in an environment that is been air gapped for many years, and you have many bits of legacy equipment, and without knowing what's in their environment, I think it's entirely reasonable that those things may exist, and they will have all the mitigations for it. So, but there can be some, without an understanding and appreciation of legacy challenges, it can get a lot of very, very difficult to manage messages, because the things we assume are a problem can, and particularly even from an IT security perspective, the things that we think of as normal and not normal controls are often very, very difficult to implement in those legacy OT environments. And I think it's, we've got to step back and appreciate the hard work that everybody is putting in this space, and make sure that the right and proportional controls are driven in by legislation. So, and I think, so I think that's something we've got to always consider. Every environment is difficult. You will have some of those highly segmented standalone legacy systems like you get in nuclear generation or in reprocessing. But on the other end of the scale, you've got that highly interconnected, highly interdependent IT/OT environment in manufacturing and supply chain, which is, it is intrinsically interconnected. It is intrinsically digital, and we need to allow for that and make sure that the right controls can be put in place to keep things flowing, because we need goods on our shelves as much as we need electricity. We've got to eat, and so I think it's also good to see that shift in legislation, not just to look at things like electricity, but also to look at all of the things that are critical to us in civilization.
We all know that government departments aren't necessarily the greatest at talking to one another or even planning together, about what they're about to put in place as these are the new guidelines. And in the UK, we have ombudsmen who do this all the time, and you see conflicts within organisations because two different legislations, a cybersecurity legislation that says one thing could actually kind of countermand or break legislation from another completely different department, nothing to do with cybersecurity, and it was something that I kind of gleaned out of the whole kind of the old technology thing. Where, you've got legislation that says, right, you've got to keep an uptime of this amount of time. You've got to, maintain your pipeline or maintain your electricity feeds and gas feeds or whatever it may well be. But then on the other side, you've got cybersecurity saying, no, you can't have those systems because they're old. Who wins in that situation? Do you end up in this kind of deadlock environment? Because they're never going to talk. The gas people are never going to talk to the cybersecurity industry or ombudsman if we end up with one of those in the UK. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Do you see that first of all, and is that something you kind of live in a bit of fear of? It's like, who wins?
Yeah, I don't really know who wins. I don't know who loses as the consumer. I mean, because at the end of the day, the companies are running thin. You can't take a manufacturing company and say, okay, now suck up another $50 million budget, for compliance or whatever. So all these costs have to get passed to the consumer. So at the end of the day, now who wins and those arguments between, competing, authorities and everything, that's where I feel like, the only practical way that I've personally ever been able to do it is to try to build a high watermark and say, if you're saying, 5-character password and you're saying 10, let's do 10. But even that's complicated since it's a moving target. And I think also what you kind of teased out is do we even want passwords? I mean, if I can have a better way with MFA and no passwords, why shouldn't I? So that whole idea of technical feasibility, being built in and say, if you could make really practical compliance requirements that say, at least do this, but anything more secure than that is okay. But a lot of times they don't have any kind of a caveat like that. It's strictly at the words, whatever the words mean, and the compliance requirement is what you have to address. So even if the intent of the requirement is met, that's where I guess attorneys hash it out in court at the end of the day.
But that's expensive for as you say, that's expensive on the budgets themselves, because normally you're the one that's fighting it in court, and of course, if it sets a precedent, then it has a knock-on effect to a lot of other organizations within the environment who are having the same kind of concerns.
Yeah, I think I can think of two examples of where legislation is to the detriment of the advancement in cybersecurity. One is on information exchange. The hesitance that many organizations have in order to quickly share information with their peers to try and mitigate the threat and from expanding fast is that ultimately, once you get to the process, the point of in a process of declaring the event, you start a chain of events. So there is there's a delay for people waiting until the absolute certainty that this has gone from being an incident to a potential cyber incident to a cyber event. You need to be once you get to that point where you're saying, "Yep, I'm declaring that this is an incident," and it starts to become reportable. People will hold off from that as long as they feasibly can until they've got absolute certainty. And during that time, that's when information is we struggle to get that exchanged. And there've been many cases where your organizations within there's almost a certainty that they're under some sort of attack, but the ability for them to very quickly share in order to manage the threat and help others from being hit by the same thing, it can be delayed by that. The other thing is around technological advancement.
Until you're eradicating an event too, until you're at the point where you're resilient against a reattack, you don't want to share that. Even if you have a government mandate. If you have let's go back to our old Windows 95 or whatever, and you say, okay, we have to go and isolate and get jump boxes and do some kind of mitigation before we announce this to the public, because we still have 75 of them out there or whatever, our exposure is still there. So then all of a sudden you got this, the little angel on one side and the devil on the other. I'm not going to say which is the government, but one of them is saying, you shall report now. Another one's saying, if you report now, you're going to open yourself up to further attack from other adversaries.
There's a similar issue around vulnerability disclosure as well, in terms of the moment you go through a process of telling people that there is a vulnerability, you want to make sure people are aware of it, but you also you're exposing that vulnerability to adversaries who might use it. So, but the other area seen where legislation sometimes just drives a stiflement of development is it's. If you take an example like cloud-based technologies, sometimes the cloud is the solution. There are some resilience reasons why people might not want to adopt the cloud in OT, and that's not really the debate. An organization deciding it should put its SCADA in the cloud, should be driven by whether they want to physically host it somewhere else and whether they can stand up to the idea that it might not be in their own direct physical control. But actually, most organizations aren't worried about whether it's physically the right place to put it. They're more worried about how do they demonstrate compliance if they put their stuff on other people's machines. Because when you've got legislation that says you must be able to declare who has ever had physical access to a particular computer, and you don't even know where that computer is, because it doesn't matter where it is. You want to be, then you can't demonstrate compliance, so you can't move towards it, which means you're stuck on a legacy technology. Microsoft Active Directory is a great example of that. The on-premise version of it is ultimately riddled with flaws. It's been the sort of the key way of managing access into so many systems for so long. Azure AD is the future. That is the one that is architected differently. It's the one that is going to be kept maintained and up to date. So managing a standalone on-premise environment using just purely the legacy technologies is going to get incredibly difficult in the future. If you're trying to keep on top of it, keep it patched, and all the rest. But it's difficult for people to adopt those new technologies because it's in the cloud and the legislation doesn't allow for it. So I think it's going to be something that legislators need to continue to think about, is how do you deal with the fact that new technologies will emerge that might be better and might be more resilient. I'm not going to argue whether it's the right thing for people to do it or not. But the fundamental principle is that sometimes the next technology might be better and the legislation might stop you from taking it. We deal with many utilities who still use serial links instead of IP links. Not because they're actually better, are actually more secure, but it's the way that the legislation handles those things and and allows them to have slightly different control sets. And so it's the logical decision for organizations to take. And so technological advancement is stifled by that legislation and actually to the detriment of the risk profile.
Which is, you read my mind, Phil, on that one, because that was the other side of the question. I don't see a lot of third-party management starting. Some of it is starting to come into the more commercial stuff. You see a lot of it now, because I think they've gotten used to the idea. Finally, in some cases, not going to mention any particular compliance legislations because I'll get in trouble. That third parties are now a thing that are here to stay as a service functions, platform as a service, software as a service. All of this different stuff is now being served from independent organizations that make up the whole of your infrastructure. And you mentioned Azure, we're reliant on the security of that organization holding those functions as well. It's not just us anymore. We now have to consider the wider third-party food chain as well. And I'm seeing a significant challenge with that realization coming in the commercial world compared to kind of companies that come under quite strict government legislation like OT organizations. They must be having a nightmare with that one because, obviously, I'm guessing the adoption in that space has been relatively slow compared to the more commercial world. But does their legislation even support it? And is it even coming close to being able to support the fact that, they could do it cheaper, feasibly better through some kind of as a service function? But at the same point, this is then going to push the problem out even further. I mean, DORA, for instance, it's not just for financial institutions, it's also for organizations that deal with those financial institutions. So there's a domino effect in the food chain. Are we seeing that? Are we going to start seeing that in legislation coming out of government bodies? Because I do worry about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example. When I first read the NIS directive and started to see who would be in scope of that, I remember asking whether Philips would be included because they control more load than the average substation in their ability to switch on and off light bulbs, and so it's. I think there's a much greater level of integration of the supply chain than maybe we appreciate, and aggregated risks associated with the supply chain in OT are quite considerable. The industrial giants have become the size that they are because they are very business savvy, and these are 150-year-old businesses that have adapted many, many times, through their life, and most of them. If you were to consider the largest, the Siemens, GEs, ABBs of the world, they have all been through many adaptations of their business model, and so they've shifted not just from selling boxes to selling services, and that way beyond them, others have copied that model. They're moving from the idea that they used to sell big pieces of industrial equipment to that they now almost service that for its life. And we find many organizations that traditionally used to buy things to them almost buying services. If you look at the wind industry, many organizations now that own wind farms are not big power companies. They're pension funds. What do pension funds know about managing engineering assets? They don't know anything. They don't care. They manage assets. They manage financial assets. How are they going to manage a wind farm? They're purchasing services. And you buy turnkey facilities. You buy they don't say, I would like to buy 50 wind turbines. You buy a certain number of megawatts of output, which means that we're seeing these OEMs. And we're seeing, actively working and connected to these assets throughout their life, or people buying them, but they're buying them with service contracts, connected with those assets for 25 years. So who and why, from a connection point of view, is expanding massively. And so even in those traditionally very vertically integrated organizations, which could create very natural digital divides between their IT and their OT at different levels, we're seeing a lot more interconnectivity and a lot more shared threat across that landscape as well. And it can be, very challenging, for those organizations to manage against, different commercial frameworks and different legislation across multiple international boundaries. I don't think that the legislation is quite there yet to start to recognize that the supply chain is part of that. But there are things in consultation, for updates to the NIS directive that start to look at key suppliers will fall into the scope of these things if they have that connectivity, rather than just the asset owners themselves. And so it's evolving. I think there's a recognition that there's this fundamental change in the market by legislators, but I haven't seen anything really significant in the OT legislation space that allows for it. In some cases, the legislation still makes that remote connectivity very difficult, which may drive inefficiency in those businesses. There's still very limited remote connectivity into, say, the US power system, certainly for the BES high and medium assets, because the legislation just doesn't really allow for it, which means that the traditional model of buying assets, building them yourself, and maintaining them is still there. But in other countries where the legislation is different, we're seeing very different commercial models being deployed by the vendors who are building and servicing those things. But the only way for them to achieve economies of scale and ultimately deliver benefit to the ratepayer and the consumer is by having remote connectivity. So we're seeing it's going to happen. That shift is occurring, and the legislation needs to keep up with that.
I think that's a key success factor for legislators. They have to be able to empower companies to adopt new technology, as opposed to creating this paradigm where the only people that are compliant are the ones that are falling behind in terms of operational. Like they're not competitive anymore with others out there in the field, because they're putting all their emphasis on legacy controls and trying to make their compliance program real easy to maintain.
And it's hard as well, because obviously, the older the technology gets, this is the weird dichotomy behind it, the more expensive it gets to maintain the damn stuff, and I mean, the movement to third party allows you to kind of skip ahead in a variety of different ways to kind of be able to provide assurance that solutions are going to be up to date and so on and so forth, because you can mandate it through contracts and all the rest of it. But then, you're a CISO for a service provider. It's, are you starting to get kind of like increased oversight into how secure you are as an organization from your customers? Because I'm definitely seeing it over my side of the fence. It's still early days. There's a lot of kind of questionnaires that you get, usually based off of ISO and all the rest of it. But are you starting to see people saying, actually, no, we want to sit down and actually, I'm a CISO at, I don't know, XYZ company, and we've been using you for a year. Can we sit down and have a conversation about security, what you guys are doing, and understand a bit more about the strategy that you have behind it, rather than relying on the answers to an actual, spreadsheet form?
I still think the majority of them are spreadsheet forms, most because the CISO of the org that's going to scrutinize us is very busy and also has their own fires, and so they're largely outsourcing that within their team, to their third party risk managers. But once in a while, we'll get someone that'll. I'd rather meet with the CISO. because sometimes we'll get a third party, we'll get someone, especially when it's a contractor. Some company doesn't even do their own third party. They ironically outsource that to a third party, to vet their third parties or whatever. It's going to get recursive if I don't watch it there. But those people, sometimes they're check boxes, and they'll say, do you X, Y, and Z? And then as we're going down through it, there's something that, no, we didn't do that. 5 years ago, we quit doing that. Here's a better way. But it's just like the whole compliance paradigm I've been talking about. Now we're out of compliance with their internal program because we don't do a thing that's legacy. So then if we're able to sit with their security leadership or with anybody internal to the company that really understands it, then we can say, here's a prime example. And then we can explain exactly, we can show them. I welcome that kind of scrutiny. It's good. But here's what I don't like. You want to hear about a thorn in the flesh? When some adversary just blogs something, and then all of a sudden now 20, 30, 50 customers come out of the woodwork and say, it's just blog for real. And then you have to start answering questionnaires that you've already answered 3 months ago or a year ago because someone made an allegation. That's a problem. How does that scale? How are you going to do that whenever you have hundreds and hundreds of customers? You have to have a whole team now of the disinformation team that goes out and starts proving that everything that people say that's a lie is a lie. I understand the need for. I feel like if I was the CISO of this company and I heard an allegation against one of our third parties, I like that the awareness is there that third party risks are real and that any connection into your environment is a threat vector. I get that totally, but man, we can't let FUD be the guide, right? If every time we hear a thing, we start panicking and we deviate from our processes and start making a whole bunch of new mandates, even internally, all the people within a company that have to track that and follow it and meet with people. And, it's a distraction, I think, from real security again.
Steve, you and I are very, very similar. I totally agree with you. More often than not, if you just sit down with the other CISO and just kind of have a bit of a chat with them, you can get them far more than you're ever going to get out of a simple spreadsheet. I get really annoyed with the tick box exercise, and with our service providers, we're a company, we've got our own service providers. Maybe not Microsoft. It's kind of harder to do it with that kind of organization when we're the size that we are. But we have a hosting company that provide a number of systems for us, and I sat down specifically with their leadership and their CISO and said, right, so tell me a little bit about yourselves, what you're doing. Pretty much did the security rundown that I would do for customers when we first go in, and they say, could you tell us what our security's like, please? And I think it's important to have that. And it's important as well that if there is a misinformation attack, that they can reach out to somebody they know and trust and say, hey, Steve, look, I've seen this in the media, or, we've got a bit of a concern at management that there's new legislation coming in. Can we just kind of have sort of 10 minutes, maybe, meet up for a pint and a chat about, I'm British, obviously it's going to be a pint and a chat, a pint and a chat and discuss, what we're going to do about it, or, you're one of our key suppliers. It could be all done a hell of a lot easier if we just did that.
Yeah, that relationship is key to the whole thing, right? Having that trust and that transparency. If people are not incentivized to share and to be open, then it hurts us all. Okay, maybe I'll look better for a minute, but someday somebody is going to tell what actually happened. If I go in there and I am too vague and I don't give people actionable intelligence or actionable TTPs out of a certain attack, I think that kind of transparency, we got to somehow foster that. I know, and I appreciate the Biden administration, executive order about that, kind of forcing, gets back to what Phil said earlier, that the early days of compliance were to force people to do the right thing because people weren't doing the right thing.
Yeah.
I remember hands-on, I watched people surf the web from HMIs, the devices that control, the inner workings, the control systems at electrical utilities, and with no firewall in between or whatever. Let's go way back and talk war stories. So before NERC SIP came out, a lot of people were doing the wrong thing. Maybe it was because of a governance problem inside their company. They didn't have the budget, the understanding. They didn't have people they could trust, that knew it, the subject matter expertise. But at some point now, I kind of hope that it evolves to where compliance is not that, where it's truly, where legislation actually is getting help into the hands of the practitioners as opposed to another hindrance from real security. I don't know. Maybe I'm just dreaming, but that has to be the goal of legislation overall, right? Over time.
Yeah, I think in many respects it's there to it should be there, and this is the other bugbear. I mean, we're kind of reaching the top end of our time together, so I mean, I'll kind of say my piece. I think one of the biggest problem I have with specifically government legislation is I do wonder sometimes whether or not they actually include a good set of InfoSec professionals to advise them properly on what they're saying. We did get a few laughable ones in the UK Parliament where it's like, we need to legislate the internet. Okay. That's going to be interesting, isn't it? How are you going to regulate the internet now? I mean, the time to regulate that was like 20 years ago when it was first created. You didn't do it then. It's not that beast that it was 20 years ago now. And it's like, it's putting a lot of stress, for instance, on like social media. I mean, I'm not a big fan of social media at the best of times, but they're now saying, oh, you've got to regulate this content. And you go, how? You've got millions upon millions upon millions of users who are talking about millions upon millions of subject matters and posting millions and millions of things. How can you get any one company to regulate it? I mean, we can barely regulate our own event management. That's why we go to fantastic companies like Dragos, to help us do that. It's just crazy for me. And I just wish that they would maybe think a little bit better and get like proper peer groups. Because I was involved in the CSFI, the Cybersecurity Forum Initiative, many years ago when they first started. And I had a great time with those guys. And I got to speak to some interesting people in elements of the American government and what have you that I would never normally have access to. And it's a great team there. So, look them up out there if you're ever interested. CSFI, great bunch of guys.
I think it's obviously important that that any opportunity to provide support and feedback to legislators is there. I don't think a day goes by when some people aren't consulted on what they think. I don't think that legislators are deliberately doing things in a box. I think they're often responding to time constraints and budget constraints, which limit how far that they can reach. But the opportunities are there for those InfoSec experts to get out there and get involved. But I suppose one of the big challenges is that capacity challenge flows both ways. CISOs are some of the most busy people in the world. So the likelihood they can just sort of in their free time reach out and provide that support is hard as well. So I think it's not easy to carve that time out on either side to try and feedback, but I think that's something that's entirely necessary. And I think that if legislators reach out, often they will get the support that they ask for. And if they tell people that there's a time constraint, people want to help because they want to avoid the pain that could come from the wrong thing being put in place. So it's important that those in the know take the time to reach out and help governments and legislators as well, to help them come to the right conclusion, because they aren't going to be able to hire people, and even if they did hire people, that their relevance starts to drift because it's a constantly changing environment. So I think that we all have to continue to work together and collaborate as much as possible to try and form new legislation as it arrives.
Fantastic. Right. Well, we've reached the end of our time together. Thank you, Steve, Phil. It's been absolutely fantastic working and having a chat with you guys about the subject matter. I know we've got a few other things posted up, and at some point soon, if you haven't already seen it, by the time we release this, I will be interviewing Steve myself. We'll be having our own little chat at some point. So, absolutely fantastic. It's been really good talking about this. We're probably going to have to return to this in another 6 months because everything will change, or something new will come out and we'll all be sitting there commiserating over it or trying to figure out how we're going to damn well do it. But thank you ever so much, guys, and look after yourselves. And to all of you out there, thank you ever so much for watching. We're doing new content all the time. Please feel free to get in touch with us if you want us to attack something and bring on board specific guests. We're always open to collaboration. So thank you very much, and we'll speak to you all again soon.